Who was in charge of the Jerusalem Second Temple? As you can see, a replica here based upon the dimensions given in Scripture by a good artist. Not myself, of course, but who ruled it until its destruction in 70 CE? Many would say out there, the Sanhedrin, or the Jews ruled the Second Temple, and well, yes, but in the Sanhedrin, there were Pharisees and there were Sadducees, and some of them were also known as Scribes. Now, this topic may seem too trivial, especially not a big deal to most Christians out there for sure, unless one believes in observing the biblical feasts according to our Creator's timing, on the exact specific timing ordained and appointed regarding the dates every single year. For example, when is Shavuot? In the Greek, that's Pentecost, count 50. When is that 50th day? Knowing when the first day is key, of course, and it's also known as the first day of the Omer, when the wave sheaf offering was done while there was a temple, which is also when to begin counting toward the 50th day. And Pharisees later became what is known as Orthodox Judaism. The successors did, and each year, according to the Talmud, they began their first day of counting this Omer toward the 50th day would be after the first annual Shabbaton. That's the 15th day of the first month, and so that the 16th day would be the first day counting toward 50. And the Sadducees, on the other hand, became Karaites by the 8th to 9th century, and according to their history, they've been counting it from the first weekly Sabbath, the day after the first weekly Sabbath, starting with the Sabbath either on Passover or during those 7 days of unleavened bread, to put it in a simple nutshell. They began counting so that Pentecost, the 50th day, is always on a Sunday. Now, how could these two camps disagree 2,000 years ago, with Hebrew being their native tongue? They knew Aramaic, they knew the Greek language, because that was the language of the Roman Empire, and the Septuagint, as most of you know, was written about 200 BCE. So how could they disagree 2,000 years ago? I haven't found any evidence from any witnesses during the time of the Second Temple to say there was a disagreement, such as Philo, Josephus, and other authors that recorded while the temple was up. But the debate and the difference shows up in the Talmud written centuries later. So it's the theory that they disagreed in the first century. Unless someone can provide some real evidence of that for me, I would greatly appreciate that. But regardless of whether there's a difference 2,000 years ago or not, whoever was in charge of the Second Temple relates best to the New Testament. We say the Brit Hadashah writings, the New Covenant writings regarding Pentecost, the Greek word counting 50, for its timing accuracy from Acts chapter 2 onward, through the New Testament especially. And such causes modern New Covenant, believers in keeping Shavuot, the Hebrew word. Pentecost is a Greek word for the 50th day. And so feast keepers observing this same annual timing, wanting to do that in modern times, are looking to that who ruled the Second Temple to give credibility on who was accurate and right with potential homonyms, Hebrew homonyms from the actual written Torah, as they have come to a disagreement on certain key words that I'll cover in the next teaching that I record, Yah willing. It's my next springboard. This is just a foundation video teaching regarding who ruled the Second Temple. There were Sadducees, and then there was Pharisees and the Scribes. So there's the Sunday Shavuot versus any day of the week. In case you're new to this, a lot of you listening to this know this, so I hope you bear with me with covering the basics, because there's a lot of new people awakening to this and observing it and wanting to do it his way and his timing as he has appointed it to be like an annual anniversary of great things of the past when the 10 Commandments were spoken from Mount Sinai and spoken in tongues to all the nations that were there with the Israelites at Mount Sinai. A lot of good history, Jewish history, to emphasize that, including from Rashi. And then there's also the new covenant when the Spirit, with the promised Spirit from Jeremiah 31, and the new covenant prophecies of the new Spirit and a new heart and a Torah reading in your heart and so forth with those prophecies. But this leads to the topic of this teaching. As I title this message, Who Ruled the Second Temple? For biblical feast keepers. If you don't believe in keeping the biblical feast, then of course this topic really isn't for you, unless maybe it'll trigger an interest and a curiosity to learn and build a passion for them as well. Feel free to listen. This is free and it's offered for the public, for anyone who wants to. And also make comments in the comment section of this YouTube video as it'll be uploaded. But moving on to my slide, the Talmudic, the Jewish Historical Claims, written again since 200 CE. This is 130 years after the temple was destroyed. And then we have the first rabbinic writings, and they claim, the history written centuries later, of course, after the destruction of the temple, that the Pharisees were in charge of and they ruled, if I may put that word as well, either ruled or were in charge, who was primarily ruling and in charging, and which way did the temple do it. Regarding the Moedim, here we're going to cover this section on this topic now, including the timing of all the Moedim for that matter, not just this one. As we see in Leviticus 23, we see the biblical feasts, Moedim, as the Hebrew word is, and I don't want to go off on any deer trails, but which this included when to begin counting 50 days to Shavuot as the high holy day. The annual Shabbaton is on the 50th day. In case anyone out there listening is new to this and they don't know yet, it's the actual annual holy day of Shavuot Pentecost on the 50th day. Now, they claim, the writers of the Talmud and the Orthodox Judaism, that Shavuot can be on any day of the week, depending on the beginning date. If the first day, for example, I'm just giving an example, was on a Friday, they would count 7 weeks, not 7 weekly Sabbaths. And so for 49 days would equal a Friday 50th day. As this year in 2020, they're going from Friday to Friday. And of course, they always add an extra day for all the annual Moedim, except for Yom Kippur. They don't want to fast for 2 days in a row, of course. So, but all the others, they'll do a double one. And I'm not going to go off on a tangent with that topic either, but simply stating a Friday to Friday, if you're kind of count it the way Orthodox Judaism has claimed from the Talmud going onward. Or versus the first day of any weekly Sabbath, the day after, is always on a Sunday. The first day of the Omer, the first day counting up toward, would be a Sunday, and plus 7 weeks, 7 Sabbaths would be 49 days, and always a Sunday Shabbaton. So which way did the temple do it? We know what the Talmud proclaims, as I've stated. But as an example of diverse Torah interpretations, let me just do a quick example here. My next video teaching, I'll go into more detail with these homonyms, potential homonyms, if I may word it a little more technically correct. But the typical Pharisaic Orthodox Judaism, their interpretation, if they go to Leviticus 23 verses 15 through 16, is, and you shall count for yourselves from the morrow, or the day after, of the rest day. They interpret it rest day, but that Hebrew word is Shabbat. Those that three-letter word there, the Shin, Bet, and Tav, and the Strong's Concordance is 7676, easy to remember. From the day when you bring the Omer of the waving. And that's referring to verse 11, if we go back to that, but I'm not going to in this teaching. 7 weeks. Now that Hebrew word there is Shabbatot. So the Vav and the Tav suffix makes it plural instead of week. or Shabbat, it would be Sabbaths, would be the way to translate, or they say weeks. They say it's a homonym 2,000 years ago. It was an interchangeable word. I'll address that more in my next video teaching. Continuing on here, they shall be complete, these 7 weeks. Verse 16, until the morrow or the day after the 7th week. And that says ha-Shabbat, that hey in there before Shabbat. So saying the Sabbath. So the morrow of the Sabbath, you shall count 50 days. And that's referring to verse 11, the day after the Sabbath. And the big debate is it is week and Sabbath, both possible interpretations. Is it a homonym? I'm quoting from the Stone edition. This is a modern Orthodox version of the Tanakh, also known as the Old Testament. So this is the Sadducean or Karaite. And most New Covenant believers, and also even the Christian translators, translate it this way, like the King James and many others. Same verse here says, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. Again, that word Shabbat. From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Lord. It's that holy name there, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. As we say Yahweh, Yahuwah, others say Yehovah, but we know who we're talking about here. Same scripture here. So this is the kind of just exposing the differences between Sadducees and Pharisees. So the correct homonym interpretation will be explained, as I mentioned, in a future video teaching. I will be uploaded onto YouTube. I did already back in 2013, but I didn't know about editing and inserting visual aids, so I'm going to do that better in this next one with a presentation slide like I'm doing now, so you don't have to look at me the whole time, and it'll make a lot more clarity to it with good video editing to complete soon. Yah willing, I must say. Don't want to be too bold and dogmatic about that. But let's move on to the next slide. Review. Let's review the diverse interpretation in a nutshell. Same verse here. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. Now, is that an annual one, like the first day of unleavened bread, or we say matzot, versus the weekly Sabbath? From the day that you've brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7, okay, is it weeks or Sabbaths, shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th. Is it week or Sabbath? This is the verses here between the Karaites and Orthodox Judaism today, and most of us who are observing these days as believers in the Messiah, Yeshua, and the New Covenant writings. It says here, continuing, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Most High. Now, Pharisees to Orthodox Judaism, again, has chosen the interpretation of weeks so that Shavuot is rarely on a Sunday. And they also fix it to Sivan 6. That's the 3rd month. And they fix it to that. And that's based upon the mathematical calendar, modern calendar calculator, where they have certain months can have only 29 days or 30 days, not based upon the visible crescents anymore, but more of the dark invisible moon with postponement rules. I'm not going to go off into that. But the Sadducees and the Karaites, and most of the New Covenant believers today, as you'll notice, have taken the interpretation of Sabbaths. So that Shavuot Pentecost is always on the 50th day and always on a Sunday every year. Now, because there's controversy in the movement and people are getting confused, is it a homonym? And the Pharisees seem to be more right. And if they're ruling the Second Temple, a lot of people are just doing that. And I, including myself, a few years ago, for about, I think, 4 or 5 years, I was doing it the Pharisaic Orthodox Judaism way that's expressed from the Talmud going onward in Jewish history, the way they've interpreted the Torah. But whoever ruled the Second Temple until 70 CE with most authority regarding the Moedim makes it a greater influence, a greater impact upon the New Testament, as I've stated, especially the book of Acts and going on here. So regarding when or which date each year that the annual observed Shavuot Pentecost, as expressed in Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17, these festivals and even the Sabbaths, everything is a shadow of things to come. In the physical realm, it's a representation and transition to something much greater. And they're shadows, like rehearsals of the past, but they're also shadows of things to come. Not the actual real thing, but a shadow of it. Gives you an outline, a basic idea, and something to practice, like wedding rehearsals. We're not quite there at the wedding yet, but we're rehearsing and trying to get it better and more accurately as we go. So let's take a look at the best Jewish historical evidence on this topic. I hope you don't mind if you're interested, and will help to determine who was ruling the Second Temple. As I've obtained from an elite modern Jewish, he grew up in Judaism and yeshiva schools and became a Christian. He's a scholar on the biblical calendar. Herb Selinsky, his website is thebiblicalcalendar.org, and I'm going to take a little bit from his document titled Treatise on the Biblical Calendar, and he updated it, second edition, in April 8, 2009. But I'm going to go to page 67, where he really addresses this topic more specifically. And according to the view of Bar Ilan, he's a historian, an expert scholar in the realm of scribes and priests during the 1st century CE. This is where his specialty and his studies were. And we can see that the Sadducean priests were primarily in charge of the Second Temple, and the scribes were heavily represented by the Sadducean priests. I'm not saying that they were all Sadducees. I'm not saying that all those who were in charge of the Second Temple, but we're talking about the Aaronic priests at the time, which were the high priest and also the majority doing the priestly functions of the Second Temple. And I'm not talking about the shuls, the synagogues, where most of the people were. Big difference between that. That's why they're not doing sacrifices today. There's a big difference between that and shuls and synagogues for every Sabbath. Now, many believers have been unaware of the representation of the Sadducean priests among the scribes, causing not only a distorted view of Shavuot and counting the Omer, but also Matthew 23:2 for that matter, and regarding the actual timing of Shavuot each year. But also, you'll see if you look at that, this is why a lot of people, I'm going to get to this, have resorted to Pharisaic halakha, based primarily on Talmudic writers, of course. But the Talmudic authors, we have to remember, they're the successors, the Pharisee successors. That's what became Orthodox Judaism, even up till today. And history, this is history written, the Talmud, centuries after the Second Temple was destroyed. So it's biased toward the Pharisees, right? They're the Pharisees. They're writing history centuries later, rewriting it. And there's not a whole lot of evidence of the 1st century on this topic. So, of course, they're going to claim that they were in charge because they were the majority of the whole rabbinic realm of the 1st century. But regardless, I only agree, let me put this out there, I only agree with what's in 100% agreement with the Holy Bible, as I expose in more detail in another teaching coming up, an upcoming one soon, regarding the homonyms and can it be translated this way or that way, and why there's a discrepancy and a controversy between the two major rabbinic camps since the writing of the Talmud. But the best Jewish historical evidence on this topic is from Bar Ilan, and he wrote the book titled Scribes and Books in the Late Second Commonwealth and Rabbinic Period. And so Herb Selinsky, you can go into more detail with his writings, taking it from pages 21 to 38 in Mikra, also edited by Martin Jan Mulder, Philadelphia, Fortress Press, 1988. Oh boy, that's 32 years ago as I'm recording this right now. Now, on page 22 of Bar Ilan, I want to emphasize this, because he draws the right conclusions through his studies, and we can find the following paragraph here below. Most of the scribes of the end of the Second Temple period, when it was destroyed, whose genealogy is known, were priests. Yosef, and you can see that in the Talmud there, T. Shabbat 13:11. Yochanan also, and there's the evidence of that there, in Bet Kadros, and Josephus, and there were others of course. And so it's, like I said, it's not all Sadducees. Some were Pharisees, but it is clear that during the time of the Second Temple, priests, some of whom were scribes, so scribes were also priests, some of them, used to manage the temple property, contributions and gifts, in addition to annual tithes. We see this in Nehemiah 13:13, and also there's Talmudic evidence that in Josephus, in his writings on war, chapter 6, 387 through 91. And continuing quoting from Bar Ilan here, the temple, as the official cultural religious center, was also the center of the knowledge of reading and writing. And because of that, the priests in charge of the temple were evidently responsible for the preservation of the Torah, its copying in general, and the scribal profession in particular. Now, the New Testament confirms Sadducean role, their role and their rule in charge of the Second Temple. Believe it or not, let's take a careful look at this. Acts chapter 5:17, it says, "Then the high priest rose up, and all those who were with him," which is the sect of the Sadducees, "and they were filled with indignation," of course, against the apostles. I'm not going to go into the context of that, but notice the high priest. You ever hear the saying, birds of a feather flock together? So we can see here with evidence that the high priest at the time was a Sadducee, not a Pharisee, a Hasmonean Sadducee from the dynasty that came forth even from the Maccabees, a couple centuries earlier. There's Bethusian Sadducees and Hasmonean. So I could be a little technically wrong about one of those two camps, but nevertheless, a Sadducee here. We can see that from Acts. So Acts 5:17 shows the chief priests to be included with the Sadducees at the time. Although it is unclear, as Herb Selinsky points out on page 67, unclear how many Sadducees might be from the outside priesthood. Right, so that's in the treatise on the biblical calendar too, as I pointed out earlier in the slide here. Now, when we read Matthew 23:2, this is from the NASB, it says, "The scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses," or I might say the seat of Moses. We should see here that the scribes are mentioned first. That's very interesting. And so they most likely had a major representation from among the temple priests, which were seen to be more closely and accurately equated with the Sadducees. So you can't say it was all ruled and primarily the Pharisees. Some were in there. I'm not saying they weren't. But hence, Matthew 23 is not excluding. Here's the big point here. They're not excluding the Sadducees from Moses' seat. The reason that's important to also know is that a lot of people going into Pharisaic Judaism in this Messianic movement is because they think that the Pharisees ruled everything and everything was done their way. But we can't exclude the Sadducees and their rulership and leadership in the Second Temple. And the mention of scribes also, which included Sadducees, as listed first. It's important to notice they're listed first before the Pharisees in that context. So if people follow halakha, they say, okay, follow what the Pharisees taught, but you have to follow the Sadducees. But understanding, I'm not going to go into the context of that chapter, but it's a whole other thing to show that you can't just follow Pharisaic halakha. That's not what Matthew 23 is targeting when it says to follow what they teach. What they teach according to Moses. When you're in Moses' seat, you're reading the Torah without your own personal commentary. And that's another deer trail I won't go off to in this teaching. But why are scribes usually listed first? I did a little search through the New Covenant writings here, and it's very interesting. We see scribes and Pharisees found 18 times in the New Testament. Scribes first, before the Pharisees. And here's a list of all of them, in case you're interested. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's where they're found. When you do a search for scribes, Pharisees, those two words, you're going to find 18 of them, probably depending on your translation as well. But Pharisees are listed before the scribes 3 times, a very minority amount of times in the New Testament. And I highlighted it because it's very interesting. Let's go to Mark 7:1, Mark 7:5, and Luke 15:2. Why would the Pharisees be listed first in these? This shows the intelligence and the inspiration from the Most High in these scriptures, because there's an intelligent reason why when we examine this carefully. Mark 7:1 and verse 5 is in reference to the Jewish oral law, the halakha. This is what became Orthodox Judaism. He's talking to the Pharisees here, not the Sadducees, of the washing of hands. That's found among the Pharisaic successors, but not among the Sadducean successors, as the Karaites have. Karaite means scripture alone. And so they don't want to follow traditions and doctrines of men that have come from the Pharisaic oral law. And that's the biggest difference between the two. But, of course, Karaites have their own oral law and way of interpreting the Torah, the written Torah as well. Not to go off on that tangent either. But when we look at Luke 15:2, this refers to them complaining. These are rabbis complaining about Messiah being seen among sinners. There's no temple judgment here. Important to realize. I'll let you go to the context of all this yourself. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's simply showing an emphasis on the majority at that location who were complaining about Yeshua being with sinners. And this is very different from even just Luke himself and all the other relevant cases I listed there in Luke. This is where he puts scribes before the Pharisees, showing that the actual Sadducees had a little more authority, a little more clout in the temple decisions and judgments, for that matter. So it's very important to see that connection here, and why our Creator, because order of leadership, even just putting in writing, shows an emphasis of I hope you don't mind that word, hierarchy. Just like in a family, it's a loving kind. It's not for dictatorship or tyranny, but leading by example, and whenever there's important decisions to be made, there should be a head of every household or every body of every congregation, just one head, not 2 heads. But for example, let's look at 1 Corinthians 12:28. It says, and Yah, here's that, I put the Hebrew name in there. It would be Greek if you're looking at the New Testament, but has appointed these in the church. Now, of course, we know that Greek word is ekklesia. It's talking about those who are called out of the world, not a building. It's not referred to a building, so to speak. But notice he says first apostles, second prophets, third teachers. So the teachers weren't above the prophets or the apostles in authority or leadership and making decisions. We see this in the Jerusalem conference in Acts 15. And he says after that, there's miracles, and then gifts of healing. That's also miracles. And helps, people who are helpers, and administrations. And then there's a varieties of tongues, languages. So notice tongues is also pointed out is not the most important gift. And Paul makes it pretty clear, Shaul in 1 Corinthians, I think 14, that pursue prophecy, pursue love, and there's greater things than just speaking in tongues. It's not on the high priority list here, but you see this in here. And you also see Paul's name always listed before Barnabas. And I found 13 times, if we're counting all the same verses, sometimes it's listed more than once in the same verse, but 13 times we see Paul listed always before Barnabas. We're not talking about who's better, who's greater, but we're looking at this, and then there's Peter's name always listed before the other apostles, but not an infallible pope. I put that in there. Please don't think I'm promoting, the infallible Pope Peter or anything like that. He wasn't like a dictator or it's all my way goes. But, it's kind of like when you see a married couple, when they list their names, usually the first name shows you who's the head of the household or wears the pants or however you want to word that. generally speaking, of course, but in Scripture, you see that hierarchy is listed first for emphasis, not about who's smarter or who's greater, but simply the understanding of hierarchy in the right way, in his way, not the way the world has abused it and the churches have misused it and it become too heavy-handed and so forth. But I don't want to go off on that tangent. But for example, let's look at Matthew 10:2 here. It says, now the name of the 12 apostles are these. First is Shimon, or we say Simon, who is called Peter, or Kepha, the rock, the pebble. And then there's Andrew, his brother, Peter's brother. And there's James, the son of Zebedee, and then John, his brother. And then the list goes on. You can see there. But Peter, go to Acts 5:29, but Peter and the other apostles answered and said. Now, it could have just said, and the apostles answered and said. Where it says, Peter and the other apostles said, we ought to obey Yah rather than men. And not to get into the context here, but Peter as the apostle to the Jews. We see this in Galatians chapter 2, and Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Galatians 2:8. Now, there was more than one apostle to the Gentiles. Why is it Paul as the apostle? He wasn't the only apostle. If we take a hyperliteral view at this, one could say, oh, yeah, there was only one apostle. But it's showing that who is the leading in these jurisdictions, if I may put it that way. So in conclusion, along with much evidence, historical and biblical, we can see that the Second Temple, 2,000 years ago, was ruled primarily by the Aaronic priests. I think we can all agree with that, but which were primarily Sadducees at the time, as well as scribes within the Sanhedrin leadership as well. Now, I'm not saying most of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees. The Pharisees were the vast majority of rabbis. Yes, I can agree with that. They outnumbered the Sadducees by far, and therefore usually ruled their local shuls, or synagogues is the Greek word for shul. Today in Judaism, they're trying to get away from the Greek and the Hellenized influence, so they'll say shul, very synonymous, the building of worship for Shabbat and other days of the week, and the Jewish converts. So not to be confused with the Second Temple. Just because they had most of the rulership and in charge of shuls and synagogues doesn't mean that they had most authority and in charge of the Second Temple. This is where there's some confusion, overlap, and transition that doesn't have good evidence to it, other than what the Talmud says. Therefore, the appointed timing of Shavuot, Pentecost, the 50th day, based upon Second Temple leadership, is not as easy to determine as most in Judaism and even in the Messianic believers have assumed, with weak evidence. Now, you can say weak, W-E-A-K, and they say it's week, not Shabbat, count 7 weeks. So here's this, it's kind of like a homophone. It sounds the same, homonym, I should say, spelled a little differently. Hope you don't mind a little bit of humor there. But Shavuot Pentecost must be based mostly upon the Holy Hebrew Scriptures, as well as the New Testament for those who believe in the same Messiah, Yeshua, or Yeshua, aka Jesus. Applying Scripture alone does make the timing of Shavuot, aka Pentecost, more explicit to determine than this topic here. But this is a good stepping stone foundation, because people let the leadership in the temple kind of dictate who's right or wrong on this topic. But this is a much bigger topic on going to the Scripture alone, which I will save for the next video, teaching, coming soon, uploading soon. So not to any theaters near you, but please stay tuned. And if you have not already, subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'll create a playlist for this topic as well. And this will be one of the videos for the playlist. So Todah Rabbah, thank you all very much. Mishpacha, my family, and his family and body.